They called her the quiet one. That was all Dr. Hargrove needed to know as he watched her move through the 4th floor of Mercy General, her navy scrubs moving like water through the hallways of Denver's most prestigious hospital. He didn't know that the soft voice asking patients about their pain levels had once commanded a field hospital under direct fire. He didn't know that the tremor in her hands during shift change wasn't nervousness, it was restraint. The trembling wasn't fear. It was muscle memory from 16 hours in Ramadi when the walls shook and the blood wouldn't stop coming and there were 47 people depending on her to hold steady. But he would find out. Not today. Not yet. But very soon, everything about Ashley Cooper was going to change. Ashley arrived at 6:47 in the morning, 7 minutes before shift change, the way she arrived every single day. The parking lot of Mercy General was already crowded with residents and attendings, their cars arranged in a hierarchy as strict as the hospital's own, the best spots reserved for department heads, the farther spots for nurses. She parked in row G, walked 3 blocks on a morning that carried the first real cold of October, and felt the Denver air move through her lungs like a memory of someplace else. The antiseptic smell hit her as she entered through the employee entrance. Not like blood and copper and desert dust. Clean. Measured. Almost peaceful. The locker room was empty at 6:47, which was how she preferred it. The metal doors had small ventilation slots that made a soft hissing sound when opened. She heard that same sound in her sleep sometimes, except in her sleep it was the rush of air escaping from a chest cavity, the pneumothorax releasing pressure like a scream. She opened locker 42 and looked at the field jacket hanging there, navy blue and worn soft from 15 years of careful washing. The seams were frayed at the collar. The zipper had been replaced twice. And inside the lining, barely visible unless you knew to look, was the faded patch. 2nd Marine Division. Just a flag. Just fabric. Just the only thing she had brought from her old life into this one. She touched it once with one finger. Not a prayer, she didn't pray anymore, just a reminder that she had survived worse than this. By 7 a.m. the floor was moving. Residents checked off their sign-outs from the night shift, nurses gathered report sheets, and the careful choreography of shift change began like a ballet performed by people in scrubs instead of point shoes. Ashley stood at the back of the conference room and listened. She never sat down. Standing gave her an exit strategy. 4th floor census is 23, said Marcus, the night nurse, reading from his clipboard. Room 412 is post-op from the femoral bypass yesterday, vital stable, dressing clean and dry, pain controlled at a 4. Room 415 is the pneumonia admission, on day 3 of antibiotics, responding well, no fever since 04:30 this morning. The words came in a rhythm Ashley recognized. Not chaos. Structure. The structure of medicine, where every patient became a status report, every person became a room number. She had lived in that structure for 12 years, from the moment she accepted the senior chief rank until the moment she signed the discharge papers and walked away from everything that had made her who she was. Dr. Hargrove entered at 7:03, which meant he was already 3 minutes ahead of everyone else's sense of urgency. He was tall in the way tall men in authority positions learn to be, not just the physical height but the posture that came with knowing that people had to look up to see him. His white coat was pressed. His stethoscope hung around his neck like a medal. He was 48 years old and had been department head of surgery for 4 years, which gave him enough power to be dangerous and not quite enough power to be truly untouchable. Not yet. Not until he called in the favors and made the phone calls and activated the network he had been building since his first day at Mercy General. He saw Ashley when she was moving toward the medication cart, her hand steady as she pulled down 3 bottles of pain medication and logged the serial numbers into the system with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that precision was how you stayed alive. She didn't look up. She never looked up. She just did the work that no one else wanted to do, the work that kept people alive in the hours between the big dramatic surgeries and the attending rounds. What he saw was a nurse who knew her place. What he saw was competence without ambition. What he saw was someone who could be useful and quiet and who would never threaten the carefully constructed hierarchy that kept him at the top of the surgical department of Mercy General in Denver, Colorado. What he didn't see was the muscle memory that had just read the medication labels in 7 seconds, categorizing them by therapeutic class, absorption rate, and interaction profile with the precision of someone who had once filled fours under mortar fire while trying to keep people alive on a concrete floor that wouldn't stop shaking. What he didn't see was Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, who had commanded 47 people in a field hospital that was 3 miles from the nearest American forward operating base, 47 people who had survived because she didn't panic and didn't hesitate and didn't let the fear show on her face. Nurse. His voice cut across the medication room like a blade. It wasn't a request. It was the kind of summoning that made new residents flinch. Ashley turned. She was still holding a vial of methadone in her right hand, her left hand resting on the medication cart, completely still. Yes, Dr. Hargrove. The Thompson patient in 418 needs to be ambulated today. She's 72 hours post-op and the surgical team needs to see progress. Make sure it happens before rounds. I'll coordinate with physical therapy. You'll do it yourself if necessary. Of course, doctor. The words came out deferential. Soft. The voice of someone who understood hierarchy and was content to remain at the bottom of it. She turned back to the medication cart without waiting to be dismissed. That was correct protocol. That was how you moved through a hospital when you didn't want anyone to notice you, when you wanted to be invisible, when you wanted to do the work and go home and live in the small apartment on Federal Boulevard and never have to explain to anyone where you had really come from or what you had really done. But there was something in the way she turned. Something in the precision of the movement. Something that made Dr. Hargrove pause for just a moment, watching her pull down one more vial and log it with careful handwriting. And then he turned away and filed the moment in the back of his mind alongside all the other moments when people disappointed him or annoyed him or made him feel, for just a second, like he might not be the smartest person in the room. By 8 a.m. the floor was full. The beds in the 16 patient rooms were occupied. The 4 pumps beeped in a rhythmic chorus that sounded like machinery counting down toward something no one could quite name. Ashley moved through the corridors with the efficiency of someone who had moved through far more chaotic spaces. A resident named Dr. Chen was walking toward her from the opposite direction, talking on his phone, his eyes fixed on his clipboard instead of on where his feet were going. Ashley stepped aside without breaking stride, her back pressing against the wall to give him a full half of the hallway. He walked past without acknowledgement, still talking about some patient's lab results, and she waited exactly 3 seconds before moving away from the wall and continuing toward room 420. The patient in 420 was a 79-year-old man named Gerald, admitted 3 days ago with acute pancreatitis that had progressed faster than anyone expected. Ashley stood at the foot of his bed and looked at the monitor. His oxygen saturation was at 94%, his heart rate was running at 98, and his full line was running clear fluids at 120 milliliters per hour. Normal. Stable. Safe. She reached over and checked the dressing on his central line with the kind of deliberate attention that turned a 2-second inspection into something that felt like care. How are you feeling today, Mr. Gerald? Like I got hit by a truck. His voice was raspy from 3 days of restricted oral intake. When can I have some water? Your doctor will clear that during rounds this afternoon, most likely. Once you can tolerate sips without pain, we'll start you on clear liquids and move from there. That's what the last nurse said yesterday. Because it's still true today. She adjusted the foot tubing so it hung properly and didn't create pressure at the insertion site. The movement was practiced. Automatic. The kind of thing you learned once and never forgot, like how to breathe, like how to keep people alive when everything around you was falling apart. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that for just a moment, when she was standing at the bedside with her hands moving in their steady, practiced way, one of those hands trembled. Just barely. Just enough that if anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed. The tremor lasted less than a second, the moment it took for her nervous system to remember something her brain was still trying to forget. Then it stopped. Her hands went steady again. She pulled away from the bed and stepped back. I'll check on you in an hour, Mr. Gerald. She didn't wait for an answer. She was already moving toward the door, toward the supply room, toward the next task, toward the careful accumulation of small invisible moments that made up a day at Mercy General, where no one asked questions about why a nurse was so competent at crisis management, where no one seemed to notice that she never sat down, where no one could possibly know that she had commanded 47 people in a field hospital in Ramadi. A woman named Ashley Cooper who had sewn the 2nd Marine Division patch into the lining of her old jacket because she couldn't wear it where anyone could see it. The supply closet smelled like antiseptic and cardboard, a sharp chemical bite that Ashley had grown used to over 3 weeks of careful invisibility. She restocked the wound dressing trays with the same methodical precision she once used to inventory field supplies in Ramadi, bandages arranged by size, sterile gauze in neat stacks, every item accounted for. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm above her, a sound like insects trapped in white plastic. The medication question had seemed simple enough. It was a Tuesday morning, the 4th floor of Mercy General still moving at that half-awake pace where nobody looked too closely at anything. Ashley was reviewing the chart for room 407, a 63-year-old cardiac patient named Robert Henshaw, when she read the order. 200 milligrams of metoprolol. She read it again. The patient's baseline heart rate was already 48 beats per minute. His blood pressure sat at 94/58. That dosage would stop his heart. She didn't hesitate. She didn't calculate the political cost. She walked to the patient's room where Dr. Hargrove was making rounds, where Mrs. Henshaw and their adult daughter were standing by the bed, where the moment the words left her mouth, everything changed. "Doctor, before you administer that dose," Ashley's voice was soft, deferential, exactly what a nurse was supposed to sound like. "That's 200 milligrams. His baseline is severely bradycardic. That dosage could precipitate cardiac arrest." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens before something breaks. Dr. Hargrove's face shifted from neutral to something else, something that looked like a man watching a spider crawl across his expensive watch. His eyes were the color of wet concrete, and they hardened as they fixed on her. He was tall, with the kind of posture that came from always being the tallest person in the room, and he wore his surgical attending title like a crown that would never be removed. 15 years of surgical experience, the kind of resume that made board members return phone calls, the kind of authority that transformed a man into someone who believed his own myth. "Nurse Cooper," he said, loud enough for the hallway to hear it. The daughter's face flushed, that immediate embarrassment that comes from witnessing a public rebuke. "When you've completed medical school and a surgical residency, you'll be qualified to question my orders. Until then, perhaps stick to bedpans and vital signs. We both know which of those you're trained for." Ashley took one measured breath. The kind of breath that comes from somewhere deep, the kind that had once kept her steady while mortar rounds landed 300 meters away. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. She maintained eye contact with Hargrove, and in that moment, something flickered across his face, a recognition, maybe, that this nurse wasn't breaking, wasn't crumpling, wasn't reacting the way people usually did when he performed his dominance. "I've seen what real authority looks like, Doctor," Ashley said quietly. "And this isn't it." A single tear escaped down her left cheek. Not from fear. Not from humiliation. From the weight of carrying something alone for so long that your eyes betray you in front of strangers. She wiped her face with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with Hargrove, and for one heartbeat, the room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze from the next patient's room. Hargrove's jaw clenched. Something flickered across his features, not anger exactly, but something closer to recognition. A threat identified. A challenger marked. He ordered a lower dose of the beta blocker. 60 milligrams. Safe. Ashley had been right, and everyone in that room knew it. But the victory tasted like copper. The next morning, a formal written reprimand appeared on the 4th floor unit board, laminated and impossible to ignore. Insubordination and overstepping scope of practice. Hargrove had added a personal touch at the bottom, his handwriting sharp enough to cut. Nurse Cooper will remember that clinical decisions are made by physicians, not by staff who forget their station. Ashley stood in front of it for exactly 12 seconds. She didn't take it down. She didn't cry. She simply read it, memorized the words, and walked away with the same measured pace she brought to everything. Her hands shook later when she was alone in her car in the Mercy General parking lot, when she gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. But not in front of anyone. Never in front of anyone. The isolation started within 5 shifts. The break room was a small space on the 4th floor where nurses grabbed 15 minutes apiece between 12-hour shifts, where conversations usually flowed like water, complaints about difficult patients, gossip about which doctors were sleeping with which administrators, the small human noise of people surviving together. On Friday of the first week, Ashley sat down with her lunch, a turkey sandwich and a container of yogurt she'd brought from home, and Martha from oncology was already there, talking to David from the ICU about staffing issues. The conversation stopped. Not gradually. Completely. Martha grabbed her sandwich mid-bite and mumbled something about paperwork. David suddenly remembered a phone call he needed to make. Within 30 seconds, Ashley was alone at the table with her cold coffee and her trembling hands wrapped around the cup like it was the only warm thing left in the world. By Friday, the other nurses had perfected the routine. They moved like water flowing around a stone. If Ashley was in the break room, you left the break room. If she was filling the medication cart, you found something else to do. If she was at the station, you kept your eyes on your own work and your voice low enough that she couldn't hear. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was worse than that, it was the quiet, systematic removal of her from the community. The death of small talk. The end of being seen. The trembling got worse when she was alone. Hargrove began his campaign in earnest. Minor policy violations that he manufactured from whole cloth, a medication chart filed 3 minutes late, a call bell not answered within the hospital's grace period, a uniform that was allegedly out of code. Each one documented, each one added to the growing file he was building with the precision of someone constructing a case. He started calling her Junior in staff meetings, his voice carrying that particular condescension reserved for people he'd already decided were beneath him. Junior here thinks she knows better than 15 years of surgical experience, he'd say, his voice pitched to make sure everyone heard it. We're going to have to work on that little confidence problem. Ashley never responded. Never defended herself. Never gave him the satisfaction of seeing her break in front of the other staff. But the cost accumulated in small ways, the way her shoulders got tighter, the way she started staying later than her shift to chart things herself rather than hand them off to the next nurse, the way she'd stopped eating lunch in the break room entirely and started eating alone in her car, staring at nothing. 3 weeks into the campaign, the universe delivered something unexpected. A Navy SEAL arrived in the emergency department on a Tuesday afternoon with shrapnel wounds from a training accident at Fort Carson, metal fragments embedded in his left shoulder and chest wall, the kind of injury that required precision extraction and a deep understanding of how tissue heals under pressure. His name was Petty Officer Marcus Wade, and he was built like a man made of angles and intention, with eyes that had seen things most people never would. Ashley was assigned to his bay. She began the debridement procedure with a 14-gauge angiocath needle and sterile field irrigation, her hands moving through the work with a rhythm that had nothing to do with civilian nursing school. She angled the forceps at 45 degrees, irrigated with the specific cadence of someone who had done this under fire, used technique that prioritized speed and infection prevention over cosmetic outcome, the Ramadi flash pattern, efficient and clean and designed for survival, not aesthetics. Wade watched her hands with the particular attention of a man who recognized something he'd seen before. "Where did you serve?" he whispered. Ashley's hands froze for half a heartbeat. Just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The precision of his question, the way he'd identified something specific in her muscle memory, the knowledge that she'd been recognized. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice had shifted into a different register, lower, with an edge of authority that hadn't been there a moment before. The voice that once commanded medics under mortar fire. The voice that gave orders and expected them to be followed. Wade didn't push. As she finished the procedure, working with a steady hand and the kind of focus that comes from years of practice, he simply said quietly, "That's a Ramadi flash pattern. Only saw it used by one unit." Ashley left the room 30 seconds faster than protocol normally allowed, her heart moving at a pace that had nothing to do with normal cardiovascular function. Wade pulled out his phone and made a call to his commanding officer. Meanwhile, Dr. Hargrove had noticed the SEAL requesting Ashley specifically for follow-up care, had seen a nurse gaining credibility with a patient, building relationships that threatened the careful hierarchy he maintained. He began making calls to board members, to administrators, to people who owed him favors. He documented every interaction between Ashley and Wade, building a file, constructing a narrative where a nurse was overstepping her authority, where a nurse was getting too familiar, where a nurse was becoming a problem that required institutional attention. The thread had been pulled. Unraveling had begun. But Hargrove had no idea that he'd just activated something he couldn't contain. That the quiet nurse he was systematically destroying had been trained to operate under pressure. That the woman he'd humiliated in front of a patient's family had once commanded a field hospital under direct fire. That he was about to learn what real authority looked like. 2 days later, everything would change. The 14-gauge needle came from her badge reel. That was the detail that would matter later when Dr. Hargrove replayed the parking lot footage 17 times, when he made his first call to the board, when he began constructing his case with the precision of a man who understood that competence was a threat and threats needed to be eliminated systematically. But that wasn't his concern at 2:22 p.m. on a Tuesday, 2 days before Thanksgiving, when the electrical fire in the third-floor surgical supply room began its climb through the ventilation system like smoke seeking its own level. The alarm sounded, not the soft chiming of a drill, but the full shrieking wail that froze the corridors of Mercy General for exactly 3 seconds before chaos bloomed like dark flowers in every direction. Ashley was in the medication dispensary on the 4th floor when the announcement crackled through the overhead speakers, code red, evacuate using stairwells, do not use elevators. Most of the nursing staff looked up from their work, checked the protocol sheets posted by the exit, began moving with the measured pace of people who had practiced this scenario in the abstract, as a possibility that happened to other hospitals, in other cities, to people who weren't prepared. Protocol said to wait for team leads. Protocol said to move to designated assembly points. Protocol said stay calm, follow procedure, do not improvise. Ashley moved. The muscle memory came before thought, the pattern recognition of 17 years watching hallways fill with smoke, of field hospital evacuations in Ramadi when the mortar fire came close enough that you could taste the dust of the building settling on your tongue. Her body knew the mathematics of survival before her conscious mind could negotiate with the civilian rules she had spent the last decade pretending were binding. She was already moving toward the nursing station, already assessing who could walk, who needed assistance, who couldn't be moved without equipment. 38 seconds from the alarm to the first patient mobilized. One of her colleagues, Janet, stood frozen at the coffee station with a cup halfway to her lips. Ashley didn't wait. Janet, north stairwell, ground floor, parking lot. Move. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in a voice that had ordered combat medics and field surgeons during incoming fire, a voice that carried the weight of decisions made under pressure where hesitation meant death. Janet moved. The 4th floor held patients in various states of recovery and mobility. The post-operative ward had 12 beds. 2 patients could ambulate with assistance. 4 were in wheelchairs or could transfer to them. 6 were bedbound, 3 of them on continuous monitoring or for support. Ashley's hands were already moving, disconnecting portable monitors, identifying which patients could be grouped for evacuation, prioritizing the mobile cases first because speed was survival and every second the smoke climbed closer. The smoke was already visible at the far end of the corridor, a grey-brown haze rolling along the ceiling like something living, something with intent. The fire alarm continued its mechanical screaming. Somewhere below, she could hear the wail of sirens approaching Mercy General from the Denver Fire Department, arriving with the kind of speed that meant dispatch had understood the scale of the problem immediately. She got the ambulatory patients moving first, 4 of them, 2 with 4 poles that she carried for them because every second mattered and their hands were shaking too badly to manage it. The smoke was getting thicker now, the quality of light changing, the fluorescent panels above disappearing into grey fog like stars being swallowed. Stairwell. Move steady. Don't run, you'll panic. Steady pace. Her voice cut through the alarms with the clarity of someone speaking into headsets during a medical emergency, someone whose words carried the authority that comes from having saved lives in worse circumstances. The stairwell was already filling with people, nurses, orderlies, visitors, patients in hospital gowns moving like ghosts through the haze. Ashley guided her group to the left side of the stairs, creating a lane for faster movement in the middle, organizing chaos into manageable flow the way a good combat medic organizes a casualty collection point. Stay focused. Stay functional. Everything else is background noise. Back on the 4th floor, the wheelchairs came next. 3 patients who could transfer themselves with minimal help. She got them into the corridors and guided them toward the stairwell, hands steady on the chair backs, her own breathing controlled and even despite the smoke that was now thick enough to sting her eyes. The visibility was dropping fast. 30 seconds and you wouldn't be able to see 3 feet ahead. The fire department was still 3 minutes out minimum. The bedbound patients were the problem. 6 of them, and she couldn't leave them. Her mind processed the mathematics with the precision of someone who had done triage under fire: prioritize, sequence, execute. The 2 most mobile came first, both with 1 nurse. She grabbed Miguel from the next station, pointed at 2 specific patients, and he understood because good medical staff understand urgency without speeches. The 4 remaining needed equipment, needed hands, and there weren't enough hands because the other staff were evacuating themselves, following protocol, which was the correct thing to do and also meant they were useless to her right now. But that wasn't her problem to solve. That was the problem for people who followed procedure. Ashley didn't follow procedure anymore. She had stopped following procedure the moment the alarm sounded, and the 17 years she had spent trying to be invisible, trying to be just another nurse, collapsed into their real purpose. She was a senior chief petty officer. She had commanded evacuation operations with 40 people, with injuries, with enemy fire 800 meters out. This was a stairwell in Denver, Colorado, on a Tuesday in November, and it was going to get solved. She organized the remaining 4 patients into 2 groups. The 2 with the most mobility first disconnected their 4s, moving with the kind of speed that comes from practice, from knowing exactly where you could cut corners and where you had to maintain protocol. Both had chest tubes. Both had recent surgeries. Both needed to be moved carefully but quickly, which was a contradiction that she had solved 1,000 times in her previous life. You moved carefully by being precise. You moved quickly by not hesitating. She did both. The second group, a post-op cardiac patient and a 17-year-old boy named David who had come in 3 days earlier with a pneumothorax and was recovering in the monitored bed in the corner, needed more care. The cardiac patient had an 4 pump, continuous telemetry, medications that couldn't be interrupted. The boy was younger, stronger, but his oxygen saturation would matter in the smoke. She made the decision in 1.3 seconds, cardiac patient to the stairwell first with portable monitor. She grabbed Thomas, the floor orderly who was still moving efficiently rather than panicking, handed him direct instructions, watched him execute them. The smoke was now thick enough that the corridor lights disappeared into gray soup. The visibility was down to 10 feet, then 8, then less. The fire wasn't on this floor yet, but the ventilation system was pulling smoke from the 3rd floor up through every duct and vent, feeding it into the surgical wing where she stood with the 17-year-old boy whose chest was already laboring in the thickening haze. "Come on, David." She had her hand on his shoulder, guiding him toward the stairwell. "Can you walk?" He nodded, swung his legs over the bed with the awkward motion of someone still healing, still medicated, still not quite certain his body would respond to commands. He was wearing hospital gowns, for line in his left arm, and his breathing was already shallow in the smoke. That was the first warning. The stairwell entrance was 50 feet away. 30 seconds of steady walking. But as they moved into the corridor, David's pace slowed. His hand went to his chest. His breathing changed from shallow to struggling, from struggling to gasping, from gasping to the high-pitched wheeze of someone whose lungs weren't expanding properly. She knew that sound. She had heard that sound in field hospitals when the electricity failed and the ventilators stopped. She had heard it in the aftermath of explosions when shrapnel punctured lungs. She had heard it in medical classrooms and trauma bays, and on the tape recordings she had forced herself to listen to during therapy, trying to normalize the sounds of dying so they would stop waking her up at 3 in the morning. The tracheal deviation, the cyanosis creeping into his lips, the desperate reaching for air that wasn't reaching his lungs, all of it meant the same thing. Tension pneumothorax. The boy's original pneumothorax had been treated with a chest tube on admission. The tube was working. The X-ray from this morning showed re-expansion. But something had changed, a kink in the tube, a disconnection, a secondary pneumothorax expanding under pressure without a way out, and now the pressure inside his chest cavity was building fast enough that his heart couldn't expand, his lungs couldn't inflate, and in another 60 seconds his blood pressure would crater and he would arrest. Ashley didn't think. Her hands moved on their own, the way hands move when they have solved this exact problem in every conceivable circumstance, when muscle memory supersedes conscious decision. She pushed David against the wall of the stairwell landing, the only place with a moment of privacy, the only place away from the panicking crowd still flowing downward. Her badge reel was on her scrubs. The 14-gauge needle was on her badge reel. She had carried trauma shears and a needle and a pen for 17 years across 3 continents, across 1,000 moments of crisis, and today those 17 years were going to manifest in a stairwell filling with smoke. "I need you to stay still." His eyes were going wide, understanding at the animal level what his conscious mind couldn't quite articulate. "You're okay." Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. "Just stay still." Her hands felt along his chest, finding the second rib, the space below it, the exact location where needle decompression would work best. The 14-gauge was already in her fingers. She didn't wait for permission because permission was a luxury that people had when they had time, and time had just run out. She drove the needle through skin and intercostal muscle and the pleural membrane in one smooth motion without hesitation. The hiss of air escaping. The sound of pressure releasing, of tension bleeding away, of a system correcting itself in the moment that mattered most. The boy gasped, his back arching, but this time the gasp was air moving into lungs, oxygen reaching tissue, the blue leaving his lips as his body remembered how to breathe. His eyes locked onto hers for a single moment, the kind of moment where gratitude and terror and recognition all happen at once, and then she was moving him again, one hand on his arm, toward the stairwell stairs where the smoke was thinner below, where his oxygen saturation would start climbing back toward normal. The parking lot. She focused on the parking lot. 12 more stairs. 20. 30. The boy's breathing improving with each flight, his legs getting stronger, his color coming back. The crowd around them thinning as they descended, as people spread out, as the immediate danger passed. Behind them, the fire department arriving, the sirens becoming clearer, the sound of equipment being deployed. But that wasn't what mattered right now. What mattered was that she had moved without thinking, without protocol, without waiting for orders, without considering the consequences. What mattered was that 17-year-old boy was alive and breathing and would walk out of Mercy General and go home to his family for Thanksgiving. What mattered was that all 23 patients who had been on the 4th floor at 2:48 p.m. were now in the parking lot, alive, breathing, accounted for. What mattered, the part she didn't know yet, was that Dr. Hargrove had watched from the parking lot as the evacuation unfolded. He had watched as other nurses evacuated their assigned patients and then stood on the pavement chatting with colleagues. He had watched as Ashley emerged from the smoke carrying a boy with a freshly bloodied chest, her hand steady, her voice giving orders to paramedics about needle decompression and pneumothorax and the exact location of the intervention. He had watched the boy's parents run toward him from the parking lot, watched them embrace their son, watched them look at Ashley with the kind of gratitude that people reserve for someone who has given them their child back. And he had understood, in that moment, that she was dangerous. Not because she had saved a life. Anyone could understand that. He was dangerous because she had saved a life in a way that no ordinary nurse could save a life. She had moved with precision and confidence and the unshakable calm of someone who had done this before, many times, under circumstances that were far worse. The needle decompression was clean, efficient, done without hesitation or equipment or authorization. It was the kind of procedure that required training he couldn't account for, experience he couldn't question, an authority he couldn't challenge. It was the kind of procedure that a field surgeon might perform, that a combat medic might perform, that a military trauma specialist might perform. Dr. Hargrove made his first call that evening, before the fire department finished their investigation, before the hospital even issued a statement. He called 3 board members. He requested an outside investigator. He began the process that would turn her heroism into her liability, her competence into her threat, her 17 years of silence into the thing that would destroy her. He was still following protocol. He was still competent. The electrical fire started at 2:44 p.m. on the 3rd floor, a fluorescent ballast sparking inside the surgical supply closet, cascading through the ventilation system like something alive. By the time the alarm sounded, smoke was already finding its way through the 4th floor corridors, pale grey fingers sliding under door frames and curling through the ceiling grid. Ashley was 8 beds deep in the medical ward when the sprinklers kicked on. Water hammered down. Alarms wailed. The noise sent patients into a panic. 3 of them tried to stand, confused, tangled in 4 lines. She moved between them with the kind of measured calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "We're evacuating. Now. Stay with me." No rushing. No raised voice. Just a hand on each shoulder, guiding them toward the stairs. The evacuation was supposed to move floor by floor. Protocol said wait for floor captains, maintain order, let the fire department direct traffic. Ashley didn't wait. She looked at the smoke thickening in the hallway and made a decision that should have stayed off the record. 23 patients. 4th floor medical ward. She moved them herself, walking the ambulatory ones down 4 flights of stairs while the younger nurses handled the wheelchair-bound, calling for gurneys that weren't coming fast enough. The stairwell smelled like copper and ozone, like someone had struck metal in a closed room. A teenage boy named Marcus, 17, post-appendectomy, scheduled discharge tomorrow, started gasping halfway down the 2nd flight. His hand went to his chest. His other hand clawed at her sleeve. "Can't breathe. Something's wrong. Can't." His breathing came in sharp, desperate gasps. Around them, other patients moved slower, smoke entering from above, someone crying, another person calling for help that wasn't reaching them yet. Ashley's hand steadied. Her mind didn't, it dropped into a gear it hadn't touched in 14 years. Tension pneumothorax. The way he was struggling, the panic in his voice, the way his chest wasn't moving right on one side, she'd seen it 100 times. She'd treated it 100 times. Intense. Under fire. With worse tools and no light. She pulled the crash cart from the alcove. It had been staging there for evacuation, abandoned when the alarms started. A 14-gauge needle. She didn't ask permission. She didn't call anyone. Her hands moved through the motions like she was remembering something her body already knew. "This is going to feel like a punch. Look away from me." The needle went into his chest wall, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, muscle memory finding coordinates that muscle memory shouldn't have anymore. The hiss came. Air escaping. Pressure equalizing. The boy's breathing changed immediately, the desperate gasping becoming something almost normal, his eyes going wide as oxygen flooded back into his lungs. You can breathe," she said. "We're moving. Now." They continued down. Behind them, a nurse was screaming something about protocol. The smoke was getting thicker. By the time they reached the ground floor, the fire department had the building on lockdown and Mercy General was a controlled chaos of stretchers and triage tents and people shouting coordinates. Ashley walked the last patient out into the parking lot, handed him to an EMT, and stood in the November cold, breathing air that didn't taste like burning plastic. Her hands were steady. Her heart rate was normal. She felt like she was looking at herself from somewhere very far away. What happened next took exactly 72 hours. Dr. Hargrove didn't attend the evacuation himself. He'd been in surgery on the 1st floor and never saw what Ashley did in that stairwell. But by the next morning, people were talking. The fire marshal's report mentioned an emergency medical procedure performed by hospital staff during evacuation. The teenage boy was being held for observation. The needle decompression had saved his life, but it was also a procedure that required a physician's order, standing orders, a protocol, something that wasn't just improvisation in a smoke-filled stairwell. Hargrove made his first call at 6:15 a.m. on November 19 to Gerald Stackpole, the chief medical officer and an old friend from his residency at Johns Hopkins. "We have an issue with scope of practice," Hargrove said. One of the nurses performed an invasive procedure without authorization. Stackpole listened. Hargrove made his second call at 8:06 a.m. to Beverly Chen from the board's compliance committee. They'd gone to medical school together, and she owed him a favor from when he'd written a letter supporting her daughter's admission to Yale. His third call went to Marcus Whitmore, the hospital administrator, at 9:16 a.m. 3 board members. 3 favors. All of them in motion before Ashley had finished her witness statement with the fire marshal. By noon, Hargrove had also placed a call to Stanford Hospital, where Ashley had worked before Denver. He asked about her performance record, her employment history, anything unusual, any concerns. He was building something. Methodical. Strategic. This wasn't yelling anymore, this was the competent machinery of institutional power, and it moved like something with its own weight. The investigator arrived on November 20th. His name was Leonard Castillo, and he had an office at St. Anthony's Medical Center in Denver, a consultant hired by the board to assess unauthorized emergency procedures. He requested Ashley's nursing credentials, her certifications, her employment history, and copies of any protocols she'd violated. Hargrove handed him a file that was already 2 inches thick, full of documented minor infractions and policy violations dating back to June. The medication dosage incident. 3 written warnings. The formal reprimand posted on the unit board. A pattern, Hargrove said. A nurse operating outside her scope. The suspension came on November 21st. Not fired. Not yet. Ashley received a letter informing her that she was being placed on paid administrative leave pending the outcome of an investigation into her conduct during the hospital fire. She was to have no contact with patients, no access to the hospital, and no discussion of the incident with other staff members. The letter was written in polite language, the kind of bureaucratic courtesy that made everything sound reasonable. What it meant was, "You're finished here. We're just taking our time proving it." Ashley sat in her apartment on Downing Street for 6 days. She didn't leave. She didn't call anyone. She read the suspension letter 17 times, looking for the words that might make this different, might change what she'd done. She found instead a phrase near the end, pending termination. Not pending reinstatement. Pending termination. They'd already decided. This was just theater. On the 6th morning, she woke up smelling cordite and smoke. There was no smoke. The apartment was cold and dark and empty. She lay in bed for 2 hours, listening to the sounds that weren't there, the hum of a portable generator, distant mortars, someone calling for casevac, someone screaming in Arabic. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was going fast. 14 years. She'd been 14 years away from this, and it was still living in her nervous system like it had set up camp there and was never leaving. She got dressed. She drove to the Veterans Affairs Hospital on East 9th Avenue. She sat in the waiting room for 40 minutes without signing in, staring at the intake forms and the fluorescent lights and the veterans around her. Some of them looked familiar, men she'd treated in a different lifetime, in different uniforms, before she became invisible. A receptionist finally asked if she needed help. Ashley stood up without answering and walked out. She was in her car when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Something made her. "Is this Ashley Cooper?" A man's voice. Military bearing in the way he spoke, no inflection, just facts. "This is Petty Officer First Class Marcus Wade. We met at Mercy General. I need you to listen to me." She listened. Marcus Wade was in a car, heading toward Mercy General. He'd checked his follow-up appointment and been told she wasn't working there anymore. A desk nurse mentioned an investigation. That was enough. Wade had spent 14 years in the Navy, and he knew what military investigation looked like, and he knew that if they were investigating her, there was something they'd found, something that didn't match the story a hospital told. He'd made one phone call to Naval Special Warfare Command. One sentence, "I need you to pull service records for an Ashley Cooper, former Navy corpsman, probably senior enlisted, definitely saw combat. Ramadi, 2006 or 2007. I think we left one of ours behind." The machinery of military investigation, once activated, moved with a speed that civilian institutions couldn't match. 2 days later, at 10:36 a.m. on November 23, a day when Hargrove was scheduled to present his findings to the board's investigator, the doors to Mercy General's main entrance opened and boots hit the tile with purpose. Petty Officer Wade, still in his sling from the shrapnel wounds. Commander James Price in service khakis, the kind of dress uniform that made everyone in civilian clothes invisible. And a man in a dark suit who moved the way federal investigators moved, like the room had already been searched and found wanting. But it was the fourth person who changed everything. An older man with weathered skin and eyes that had seen things he never wanted to see, wearing translator credentials around his neck. Farid. An Iraqi national now working refugee resettlement in Colorado Springs. He'd been riding in the car with them, and he'd agreed to come inside. No one knew yet. No one in the hospital knew what was walking toward them. The suspension letter arrived on a Tuesday, sealed in a manila envelope that Ashley found clipped to her locker. Administrative leave, pending investigation. Dr. Hargrove had moved faster than she expected. The words blurred as she read them in the break room at 6 a.m., before anyone else arrived, her jaw tight but her breathing steady. 3 board members had signed off. All names she recognized from Hargrove's calls, the one she'd overheard in the hallway outside his office, his voice smooth as oil, talking about protocol violations and liability exposure and the liability of unauthorized procedures performed by staff without credentials to back them. He'd been building this case for 2 days. She'd saved 23 lives. The arithmetic of institutional power didn't care about lives. By Wednesday, it had escalated to pending termination. The hospital's risk management attorney had issued a formal statement. The needle decompression in the stairwell was under review. Yes, the boy survived. Yes, his oxygen sat had climbed from 68 to 92. Yes, he was alive. But procedure was procedure, and the hospital's insurance carrier was concerned about liability if the case went public, if the incident report reached the media, if families who trusted Mercy General with their children started asking questions about who was authorized to do what. The questions Hargrove had planted took root. By Thursday, whispers had started among the nursing staff, some sympathetic, some not. Had she actually been trained for that? Had she endangered the boy? The doubt was a weapon, and Hargrove wielded it like a man who understood that institutions run on the fear of liability, not the recognition of heroism. She'd walked out of Mercy General for the last time on Friday afternoon, her employee badge deactivated, her name removed from the schedule for weeks out. The rain came down hard as she crossed the parking lot toward her car, and she sat in the driver's seat for 30 minutes without turning the key, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at her was the one she'd tried to bury, haunted eyes, jaw set like concrete, hands that remembered things they shouldn't. Hands that had held pressure dressings while soldiers bled out. Hands that had threaded fours in convoy casualty collection points under sniper fire. Hands that, apparently, weren't allowed to save a teenage boy's life when the alternative was watching him suffocate. Sunday morning found her in a place she never thought she'd return to. The Denver VA hospital waiting room, the fluorescent lights casting everything in the color of institutional fluorescence, and there among the khaki chairs and outdated magazines sat the ghosts of people she'd treated. A veteran missing 3 fingers on his left hand. A woman in a wheelchair, neck brace visible above her collar. A man with the 1,000-yard stare she recognized because she'd worn it herself. Ashley sat down in the corner, near the window, and stared at her hands. They were shaking. Not from fear. From restraint. From the effort of staying still when every instinct screamed at her to move, to act, to take control of something, anything, because control was the only thing that made the silence tolerable. The intake nurse looked at her chart, then looked up, and recognition flickered across her face, but not the kind Ashley needed. Not the kind that said, "I know who you are." The kind that said, "I see someone broken." She filled out the forms anyway. Mental health evaluation. Sleep disturbance. Occupational stress. All true. All incomplete. The appointment wasn't until the following week, which meant for more days of sitting in her apartment, watching the news coverage of the fire hero story that hadn't mentioned her name because Hargrove had made sure of it. The story belonged to Dr. Hargrove now, the administrator who'd coordinated the evacuation. The surgeon who'd stabilized the critical cases. The man who'd had the forethought to establish emergency protocols that saved lives. Tuesday morning. 2 days after the fire. The doors to Mercy General swung open at 0730 hours, and they came through together, Navy SEAL Marcus Wade, moving like a man who'd healed enough to walk without favoring his left side, a man in a dress uniform with Navy Commander insignia, and a third man in a dark suit that cost more than Ashley's monthly rent, carrying a leather portfolio with the confident posture of federal authority. Agent Tomlinson. Navy investigator. His eyes tracked the lobby with the precision of someone trained to notice everything. Behind them came the translator. Farid. His name had been Farid when she'd found him bleeding out in a back alley in Ramadi, insurgent medic with a femoral artery wound that would have killed him in 4 minutes without intervention. She'd been senior chief then, running a casualty collection point that wasn't supposed to exist, operating under the authority that came from being the only person in the room who knew how to keep people alive. She'd clamped his femoral. She'd pushed fluids. She'd kept his airway open while his eyes moved back and forth, not trusting her, not knowing she was one of the few people in that city who saw him as something other than the enemy. He froze when he saw her. Actually froze, his hand coming up to his mouth, his eyes filling with tears so fast it looked like a light switch flipping. "This woman," he said, his English broken but clear, his voice shaking like the ground had shifted beneath him. "This woman, she is the angel of Ramadi." The lobby went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from absence of sound, but the kind that comes from the sudden presence of something so heavy that noise itself becomes impossible. Staff members turned. The security guard at the front desk blinked. Wade's hand moved to Ashley's shoulder, not touching her yet, just offering the proximity of contact. The gesture of a man who'd been saved and now stood next to the person who'd saved him. Wade's daughter emerged from behind her father, a 8-year-old with her father's eyes and a curiosity that nothing in the world had dampened yet. She looked up at her father and asked the question in the voice of a child who didn't understand the weight of what she was saying. "Daddy, what's a senior chief petty officer?" Commander Price answered before Wade could speak. His voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of authority that didn't need to be loud. "The person in charge, sweetheart. The person who makes sure everyone comes home." Agent Tomlinson stepped forward with the portfolio. He handed it to Ashley without speaking, and she opened it with hands that had stopped shaking somewhere between the translation and the question. After-action reports. Declassified now, the word stamped across the top in red ink like a confession. Her own words looking back at her from pages she'd written 18 years ago, her name still there in the official record because they'd never told her they were keeping the records. She'd thought her anonymity was complete. She'd been wrong. Tears came down her face as she read, not the quiet kind, not the kind she could contain. The kind that came from reading about operations that had haunted her sleep for nearly 2 decades, suddenly validated, suddenly official, suddenly part of the historical record of people who mattered. Bronze Star. The notation sat there on the page, the date listed, the action described in measured military language that somehow contained the weight of 16 hours under direct fire, keeping a casualty collection point open while mortar rounds fell around the tents, while she'd moved between patients with nothing but muscle memory and will, saving people that no one had asked her to save, people that no one else could save. The hospital lobby was full now. News cameras. Staff members who'd whispered about her, about the protocol violation, about the procedure that was unauthorized and dangerous and somehow had saved a boy's life. Commander Price's voice cut through the murmur like a blade. Senior Chief Ashley Cooper received 2 Bronze Stars, he said, and the words carried weight, each one a fist striking the narrative Hargrove had built. A Purple Heart for injury sustained under enemy fire. He paused, letting that sink in. And the Navy Cross for holding a field hospital under direct fire for 16 hours. During that time, she saved 47 lives. The commander's eyes moved across the room, making sure every camera caught his face, every witness understood what was being said. 3 of those lives were my men. 3 of my soldiers walked out of Ramadi because this woman was in that casualty collection point. This woman kept her head. This woman did the job when no one else could. Dr. Hargrove appeared at the top of the administrative stairs, his face changing colors like a mood ring in reverse. He opened his mouth, and the words came out automatic, as if his brain hadn't caught up to the reality his eyes were processing. This is very touching, but it doesn't change the fact that Nurse Cooper. Agent Tomlinson didn't raise his voice. He simply turned toward Hargrove and said 4 words with the precision of a man reading a verdict, "Dr. Hargrove, follow me." It wasn't a request. It was a command, and Hargrove understood it the same way soldiers understand orders. His face went white. His mouth closed. He followed the investigator toward the administrative office, and as he walked, Ashley watched the moment his network evaporated. Board members suddenly found their phones very interesting. The hospital CEO stepped forward instead, flanking Agent Tomlinson like a man who'd just realized which side of history he needed to be on. Effective immediately, the CEO said, his voice steady and public and final, "Dr. Hargrove's surgical privileges are suspended pending a full ethics review. The board has voted unanimously to recommend termination of his employment. This institution will not tolerate abuse of authority or retaliation against staff, particularly those who demonstrated the kind of courage and medical competence Senior Chief Cooper showed during the evacuation." Cameras flashed. News reporters moved closer. The story was writing itself now, and Hargrove was no longer the protagonist. He was the antagonist in a narrative that had corrected itself, that had found its truth in the presence of federal authority and naval officers and a translator who'd traveled from wherever he'd built his new life to stand in that lobby and say the name of the woman who'd saved him. 6 months later, Ashley heard through a nurse who'd heard from someone at a coffee shop downtown that Dr. Hargrove was selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a strip mall on Colfax Avenue. Commission-based work. No steady income. No institutional network, no board members taking his calls, no one returning his emails. The invisibility he'd tried to impose on her had swallowed him completely. She felt nothing when she heard it, not satisfaction, not revenge. Just the absence of pressure, like a weight had been removed that she hadn't realized she was carrying. The ceremony at Mercy General came in May. Spring in Denver, the kind of weather that makes you believe in second chances. Ashley stood in the main lobby wearing her dress blues for the first time in 3 years, the uniform pressed sharp, her ribbons forming a column of color on her chest. Blue, gold, purple, white, each stripe a marker of a moment she'd thought she'd left behind. The 2nd Marine Division patch had been removed from the jacket lining and mounted in a shadow box on the wall, part of a permanent memorial to the hospital's veterans. Wade stood at attention in civilian clothes, his daughter Emily holding a letter written in crayon, its words large and careful, "Thank you for saving my daddy's friends." Farry placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head. The hospital CEO announced the Cooper Protocol. All emergency procedures performed by experienced personnel during crisis would be reviewed with the presumption of appropriate action rather than policy violation. No more suspensions. No more investigative hunts for violations that didn't exist. Ashley's voice was quiet when she spoke, but it carried. It had changed. 18 years of hiding had fallen away, and what remained was the voice of someone who'd made peace with what she'd done, who understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not run anymore. "I didn't save lives in Ramadi because I was brave," she said, looking at Wade, at Farid, at the staff members who doubted her, at the cameras that were still rolling, still recording. "I saved lives because they were there and I had the skills." Same reason I acted during the fire. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Wade saluted her, a junior enlisted man saluting a senior chief, the kind of respect that transcends rank, transcends time, transcends the distance between what was and what is. Ashley returned it, and for the first time in 3 years, her hands didn't shake. She was done hiding. She was done being small. She was home. If you've watched Ashley's journey from invisible nurse to recognized hero, you understand what it means to reclaim your story. Subscribe to see more stories of people who refuse to stay small, and comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know what you were really capable of doing? Like this video and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next story of hidden strength and earned recognition.